Well, you have tuned into AURN's On the Record, and I'm your host, White House correspondent Ebony McMorris. Listen to this. Deborah Archer writes in a wonderful report called White Men's Roads Through Black Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction. She says racial and economic segregation in urban communities is often understood as a natural consequence of poor choices by individuals. But in reality, racially and economically segregated cities are the result of many factors, in that she explores racism contributing to this. Well, to talk about that and also the bipartisan infrastructure framework that's going to be addressing these economic disparities and we always drill down to Black communities, is U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Thank you so much for coming on to our program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Let's go on. And what is the administration doing to address these inequities that were caused? A lot of times I would say before the 50s, but really in the 50s when we started looking at how many of these highways were constructed many times through communities of color that caused further segregation and disenfranchisement.
Well, you're exactly right. And the article by Deborah Archer that you mentioned is full of examples from every part of the country of how decisions about where a highway would go would serve to run right through a Black neighborhood, sometimes destroying it completely, sometimes splitting it in half. Other times, a highway route became a boundary, helping to segregate the city. And a lot of this was done with federal dollars, which is one of the reasons why we believe today, in the 2020s, we have a responsibility to use federal dollars to fix what was broken. Whenever we see an example of this, and again, they're everywhere. In fact, I was just in Syracuse, New York, where you could see the routing of I-81 was an example of this, and the community now is discussing what to do about it. We can reconnect communities that were divided by these decisions of where highways or other pieces of infrastructure would go. Sometimes that means creating new pathways over or under a highway. Sometimes it means capping it. Sometimes it even means that highway needs to go and it would be better for it to be somewhere else. The answer will be different in different communities, but we've got to act. And that's why in the bipartisan infrastructure framework that the president brought together, there's specific funding for thriving communities and reconnecting communities. Again, this is clearly a federal responsibility because it was so often taxpayer dollars that were used to divide and segregate when these highways were built in our past.
Let's talk about some of that. So one thing I want to talk about right up front are the Infra Grants. And that is, I believe it was 905.22 million that was dedicated to this project.
So the Infra Grants are a program for highway and other projects that's administered right in my office in the Department of Transportation. And for the first time in this program, and also another program called RAISE, which is another $1 billion or so in transportation funding, we made it very clear that when communities want to apply for funds, when there are projects trying to get these federal dollars, one of the things we want to know about is how those communities are addressing racial equity in their plans. And that was something that we did consider and did look at with the infra grants that were recently announced, as you said, about $900 million of them, as well as the $1 billion program underway right now that is called RAISE, which is another opportunity to make sure that we're doing the right thing with federal dollars based on the law that allows us to go forward and help communities, help projects move with federal dollars, but they've got to be thinking about things like this, as well as issues like climate and environmental justice.
What are you doing to get this message out so that communities know about these programs?
Well, we've worked to make it very clear in the criteria for what communities ought to be thinking about. I was excited to learn that some cities even decided to accelerate plans that they had once they learned that our department was moving in this direction. When we hear about a vision from maybe a city that sees one of those highways cutting a neighborhood in two and is proposing a way to reconnect, or when we see an opportunity to deal with the opposite. You know, one problem was a piece of infrastructure went in often through a Black neighborhood and damaged it. Another time, we have an issue of transit deserts. Just like you have food deserts, neighborhoods and parts of cities where there's no real way to get to clean or good, healthy affordable food. There's also such a thing as transit deserts, where people do not have the connections they need to get to work, to get to a good job, to get to school. And these are disproportionately in minoritized neighborhoods. That's another example of something that we've put out the word we want to hear about when a community or a transit authority has a vision to do something about it, to connect more people to opportunity. And this is why we're so excited about the president's bipartisan infrastructure framework, because it contains the resources we need to do much, much more, including the biggest investment in public transit in history at a federal level.
I think that's so important. I've had a chance to interview a lot of elderly people who live in some areas that are even food deserts, and they talk about how it is in connecting from one place to another just in order to get to the grocery store, and then on their way back having to wait an hour, depending upon where they are, on transit to get back. And even if they are disabled, having those services that kind of accommodate them as well.
Exactly.
I want to move on to talk about how businesses can also participate, like where the equity is in that, because a little bit of pushback is when Paycheck Protection Program first came out, a lot of the money first came out to non-Hispanic, white, or mostly white districts. And it wasn't until the second rollout that you saw a lot of Black companies where minorities were be able to participate. And some of it is because some of the money, those businesses that were sole proprietary or businesses, the way that they were set up, they weren't able to always participate. And with Black companies, a lot of times they're not these big firms. They don't have a lot of employees. They have one person working for them. So that was kind of like a discrepancy with that rollout. But what is the administration doing now so that businesses will also be able to profit off this? Are they unbundling some of the contracts so they can also compete with these infrastructure projects?
Right. As you said, there were a lot of equity concerns around those first rounds of aid. A lot of it had to do with the fact that those dollars followed existing banking relationships. And if you talk to certainly when I talk to Black small business owners, so often they raise the initial funding to start their business in cash. And there are a lot of issues, as we know, with access to credit and other ways to get some of those banking relationships. I think as we move forward on an opportunity like this, it's very important to make sure that businesses of all sizes, and certainly underrepresented or underestimated businesses like Black-owned businesses in the construction industry, get an opportunity. After all, we're talking about something on the order of $1 trillion that we need to invest over the course of the coming years as a country. That's a huge business opportunity for so many to build and grow their businesses. There are examples of this being done well in the past. Just one that I think of often is in Atlanta, where a generation or two ago, Mayor Maynard Jackson saw to it that there were opportunities for these businesses to help build the airport. And in doing that, helped create a Black middle class in the city of Atlanta. So whether we're talking about the business owners and making sure that in construction and related industries, there's a fair shot and a strong bite at the apple, and that we're actively supporting that, or on the worker side, right? We also know that Black workers, women, and others are often underrepresented in the building trades, but there are some union organizations that are doing a better job at doing something about that. We want to make sure to support that. The other thing I'll point to is a local hire program. We're piloting it here in the Department of Transportation to specifically encourage the hiring of people from the neighborhoods where these dollars are spent, because too often you'll hear stories of people driving by, walking by a construction project in their area, and the people working on it don't look anything like them. They want to have an opportunity to get some of those good paying jobs.
Well, that's a huge part of it. And that's what we saw, like you were saying before, when you build these highways, people can't always, you want to work, eat, live, and even go to church in your own communities. And because of this, many Black communities have not been able to do that. So you're all over the place. So I'm glad you guys are doing that. I want to quickly touch on something I really haven't heard a lot of people talk about within this administration yet, but opportunity zones. I know Representative Jim Hagedorn is proposing an expansion of those opportunity zones. And has there really been a study talking about, and we saw them really pushed under the Trump administration, has there been a study come out, or what has been the result of the opportunity zones? Because there's a lot of, on the fence a lot, because in some areas it was just, some people saw them as ways for the wealthy to come in and just get a bunch of tax breaks, but were they really helping communities that were that needed that expansion, that needed that investment?
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement around the Opportunity Zone program when it was created. I mean, I remember as a mayor, we went after it and we're glad to get some designations. These were designations you could get often for lower income areas, get those census tracts defined as an opportunity zone, and then it allowed for some of these tax breaks. Now, the big question is that actually benefiting the people who live in the communities? Or is it just making things that much more profitable for people to do what they would have done anyway? How much of this is going to real estate versus operating businesses? I think a lot of those questions are still being debated. But here in the Department of Transportation, what we've done is we've asked communities to just let us know if they're in an opportunity zone or any of the other zones that are connected to federal programs, because it's a way to alert us to the fact that this might be an area that has been overburdened or underserved. So even though we don't participate directly in that tax policy, we can just look at it as a kind of flag, a way to make it clear that a project that benefits a certain neighborhood or a certain community will also be benefiting people who met those measurements that went into an opportunity zone that had to do with things like having more lower income and lower wealth Americans.
When we look at Black communities and in the rollout of the infrastructure plan that the president is pushing, what areas specifically do you think you'll be kind of looking at first? So what Black communities do you really see in danger that really need this, that are really on the forefront?
Well, I'll mention a few things, and it's really true across the country. First of all, the transit support. Black commuters are more likely than white commuters or others to rely on public transit. And so there's a real equity issue at stake in making sure we invest there. Also, the safety investments that we're making. The fatalities for Black pedestrians, traffic fatalities for Black Americans are higher. And across the board, they've moved actually in the wrong direction over the course of the last year. We're researching some of the reasons behind that. So this infrastructure deal has dollars to make our roadways more safe. A third thing I would point to, and we've all heard the example of Flint, Michigan, but that's just one of many. Black neighborhoods are disproportionately likely to have to worry about lead poisoning. And that's why the president thought it was so important to make sure that in an equitable way, we're addressing this. As a matter of fact, the infrastructure framework says that we will get rid of every single one of these lead service lines because there's no acceptable level of lead exposure for children.
I'm glad you brought out Flint, because before I go to my last question, I did have a question about that. And I spoke with several organizations and they were talking about, a way that many of the senators have proposed to pay for this is kind of privatization. So kind of selling off some of our infrastructure. So the question is, when I was in this roundtable discussion, is how can, especially when we look at places like Flint or even Pittsburgh, how can Americans be safe and feel comfortable with kind of the selling off of some of the infrastructure when even when in Flint, we saw some of the highest levels of lead. And so what happens when we do privatize some of this and companies are not held, responsible? It's a good thing to put an initiative out, but we've seen time and time again when that happens, Black communities are affected the worst, and there's no accountability there. Nothing makes people move like when they lose their money.
Right. There are definitely cases where a private partnership can make sense, but it can never be an end run around the public policy standards that we have, the health standards that we have, environmental, labor, or other things that are so important to communities. Now, the president's idea of the best way to pay for this was to make sure corporations are paying their fair share in taxes. That's still part of the overall vision for the president's tax policy. It was not something that we could get bipartisan agreement on in the bipartisan piece. But what we did agree on there is that we've got to be sending more funding into the IRS to be able to just collect the taxes that are already owed. Remember that this money is on the table. If you just had corporations and the wealthy paying their fair share, we would be able to fund so many important priorities, including some of the other things that the president's talking about today, like making sure that we get access to pre-K education for 3 and 4-year-olds, community college, paid parental leave, affordable childcare, so many things that the American people want, that the administration believes in, and that we really need to get done in Washington right now.
Thank you. Secretary Buttigieg, I know you got to go. You got a busy schedule. Where are you going to be pushing this message next? Where can we follow you? Where can people go to even get more information and to see how this, understand more of what this administration is doing in an efforts to, I would say, even from your press release, be the driver of justice?
Well, you can look me up on Twitter, Instagram, or follow us in the news. You're going to be seeing me all over the place spreading this message. Thankful for the opportunity to convey that to your listeners. We're also going to be traveling a lot because this is one of those times that we could look back on years from now and say America made the right choice, but it still has to actually get through Congress and get to the president's desk. And you'll see me waving the flag everywhere I can to get that message out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. We wish you well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take care.